Hi everyone, welcome to the Jayda and Stitches show. Today we are going to stitch together the squares for our 2022 Totally Tunisian calendar blanket. And we're going to use the ladder stitch. It's also known as the mattress stitch. One of the reasons it's called the ladder stitch is because you are weaving your yarn back and forth, first through one square and then the edge of the other one. And the little bits of yarn kind of line up a bit like rungs on a ladder. So you might want to keep that in mind while you're stitching. It is a sewing method. It doesn't use up much yarn, so if you don't have a whole lot of yarn left over from your overall blanket construction, don't worry, it doesn't take very much at all. And it's almost a completely invisible stitch. It's really cool. It kind of presses the seams or the edges of the blanket squares together in a really neat way. Anyway, enough chatter. Let's grab our hooks, grab our yarn, we'll head on over to the craft table and we will stitch up our squares together. In order to join our 12 squares together, we're going to want around 16 to 20 yards of the same yarn and the same color that you used for the borders on all of your squares. You want a pair of scissors and, most importantly, your yarn needle. I'm using a wool needle, that's what this little loop-ended needle is called, but any large-eyed wool or darning needle will do, so long as you can fit your yarn through it. And the mattress or ladder stitch is a sewing technique, so we don't need a crochet hook for this. We're going to be joining our squares in sets of 3 by 4 rows. So there'll be 4 rows. Each row will have 3 squares in it. I'm going to join mine January, February, March, April, May, June, July, August, September, and so on. But you can do them in any order that you want. So if, for example, you really liked the way January looked next to June, then you could do any order that you want to put them in. But I'm going to keep them in the same order that I made them in. We're going to start with our first 2 squares. These are the first 2 squares in our first row. I'm using January and February to start. And remember, throughout this entire process, I've said don't worry if your squares are slightly different shaped, because the joining process and then the reblocking will help make everything sort of line up properly. You're going to have your 2 squares facing right side up. So you want the good side or the right side of your fabric facing up. And you want to make sure that your square is so this is the bottom, that's the top, bottom, top. It's the sides that we're going to be joining. Snip yourself about a yard of yarn and thread up your yarn needle, and we're going to get started. The first thing we do when we start sewing 2 squares together is to identify the bottom corners of each square, because we're going to work from the bottom up. And every single corner of every border row has a single crochet, a chain 1, and a single crochet in each corner, and you can see that there's 2 stitches worked into the same place. So a single crochet, a chain 1, and a single crochet. It's the chain 1 that we want to identify in each corner. So I'm first going to identify the chain 1 in that corner. Pull my yarn almost all the way through. I'm going to leave a little tail out. And then I'm going to pick up the other one and identify, so there's my 2 stitches that share a corner, which means this little thing in between is the chain 1. And we're going to just tie a knot. So let's just pull that taut. And you're going to tie a knot to just anchor your sewing yarn. Doesn't have to be super fancy. I like the over under granny knot. And then of course you can weave in tails later on, but you're just making sure that those 2 corners are nice and attached to each other. Your yarn isn't going to go anywhere. And here we go. We're going to work from the bottom up. We first complete a stitch on one square and then we move to the other square and complete a stitch. So much like a ladder, you're going to have straight kind of rungs of yarn between the squares. It's very, very simple. First, identify the 2 stitches that sit next to each other going up the length of your right square. Slip your hook, or your needle I should say, going through the first one and then back out through the second. So you've got the loop of the first stitch here and the loop of the second stitch up there. Pull your yarn. And then you're going to hop over to the other side. So there's the next 2 stitches we're looking at. 1, 2, they sit on top of each other. We go in through the first one and out through the next one. So there's a loop from the first stitch and loop from the second stitch. Pull that, and that creates a straight line across that joins your 2 squares together. If you want, you can pull it taut at this point, but it's sometimes kind of fun to pull it taut after a couple of stitches. So here we go. Now we're going to hop across, back to the right side. You're going to identify, see how this yarn, this yarn has come out of this loop? Well, now you're going to go down through that loop and back out through the loop above it. So you're kind of using each stitch twice. Just trying to make sure you can see what I'm doing here. So in through the first loop, out through the second loop, that's the stitch that sits directly above on that one. Pull that yarn, and now you can see that there's a second rung, and now we hop back over to the other one. There's the rung yarn that goes through this one, so this is the one we want to start with. We go down through that one now, and we go back out through the one above it, trying not to split any of our stitch yarn. And then we pull that. And now you've got 3 little rungs that join your 2 squares together. You can hold on to the bottom corner and pull it taut. And now you've got almost invisible stitches between your squares. Let's do a couple more. So you can pull it apart a little bit. You can see that there's your last rung. It came out of this space over here, so we're going to go down through that stitch and up and back out through the one above it, taking care to not split the stitch yarn. Got to rethread my needle. There we go. And then we hop across and we want to do the same thing back over here. So there's where the rung yarn comes out. So we go in through that stitch and back out through the one above it. And we go back to the other side. It comes out of this one, so we go down through that stitch. And then back out through the top. I'm holding this in the air so you can sort of see what I'm doing, but it's much easier to just work flat on your surface. Down through the previously used and back up and out through the next one. And after you've done a couple, just gently pull taut to pull the whole thing closed. If your yarn's over here, that means you've got to go back to the other side. If this rung's already got, if this stitch has a rung coming out of it, you know you need to start there. So you go down through that stitch and back out and up through the stitch next to it, taking care not to split your thread or your yarn. Oops, and you don't want to accidentally loop your yarn. So make sure that you've got your yarn out of the way. And then you hop back across. We go down through this one and up through that one. Do a couple more. Down through this one. Oop. Up through the next one. Oops, and I did it again. Don't want to loop my yarn. Make sure you're not catching it by accident, so it should always be free flowing. And then back to the other side, down through this one and up through the one above it, making sure you just get that loop. And every 2 or 3, I like to just pull it taut again. And you can see how almost invisible that join is. It looks so cool. And then you have just those outside loops of the single crochet border kind of sitting next to each other. It makes a really nice, almost a hole free join, that seam. So don't have to worry about it coming apart. All right, you're basically just going to work back and forth all the way up. Try not to miss any stitches, so if you've come out of one, you start in that one, and then you go to the next one above it. So in and out, always going in the same direction from bottom to top. And then you move over here. Oh look, I split my yarn there. Okay, I want to make sure I go through that and up. If you do split your yarn a little bit, don't worry, it's not the end of the world. Because we are joining every single set of stitches, it's going to make a nice tight seam, so you shouldn't have any worries about the whole thing coming undone or there being any tearing. But if you're a perfectionist, then you can certainly take a couple of stitches back out if you have to. And then it's back through this one and out through this one. And every couple of stitches, pause and pull gently to tighten up that seam. As you work all the way up, making sure that you tighten it as you go, you'll have a nice, barely noticeable seam here. I've seen this done with different colored yarn and you can almost not tell that there's any joining at all. And of course on the underside it looks just as neat. So really, really nice join. When you get up to the top, it's basically the same thing that you started with. You want to find those 2 corner stitches. There's the corner stitches, which means that's my single or my chain 1. And on the other side, same thing. There are my 2 corner stitches. My chain 1's a little bit awkward, but I'll find the thing right in the middle. And then you can just create, I kind of go through it twice. Maybe bring my yarn to the back. Make sure I get the whole thing. There we go. And then you can make a knot on the back. I just sort of grab any old loop there and make a nice tight knot. If you're using slippery yarn or you really are worried that your stitches might come undone, do it twice. I love these wool needles, but they do tend to drop the yarn, so you have to kind of rethread the needle several times. There we go. That's nice and tight. Nice and tight, and then you can just sort of weave that tail in underneath some of those stitches. Let's go with this side here. Back and forth a couple times just to make sure that your sewing thread or your sewing needle, I should say your sewing yarn, doesn't want to come undone. There we go. And then you can snip your yarn. And that is how you do the mattress stitch or the ladder stitch. Look at that lovely narrow join. Almost impossible to see the yarn. You're going to repeat this for every set of squares. This is my February square, this is my March square. I'm going to repeat the exact same join up between the 2 of them. Then I'm going to do the same thing for April, May, and May, June. So I'll have 2 seams in between those 3, and then I'm going to seam 2 rows together. So go ahead, join some more squares. Remember, you want 3 at a time, so January, February, March, let's say, April, May, June, and then we're going to join 2 full rows together. Once you've sewn together sets of 3 squares, I've got January, February, and March, and here's April, May, and June, you can start to sew together the long lines in between them. So you can do all 4 sets of 3 squares first, or just sort of do 3 and 3, and then sew together 1 long line, however you like to do it. But you're going to use the exact same technique. You're going to keep the right sides of your blanket facing up. You're going to start in one edge, so same place, bottom corner, and then you're going to work the ladder stitch all the way along the edge of the 2 rows together. Just like last time, you're going to identify the 2 stitches that sit in a corner and find the little chain 1 that's between them. Oops. Yarn goes in. Try not to pull it all the way through. And find the same one on the other side. So corresponding one, there's the 2 stitches, and there is the chain 1 space. And then you're going to tie a knot. And like I said, do it twice, 3 times if you've got slippery yarn. And then it's just the same thing as before. So you might find it helpful to see it this way too. So I showed you kind of going up and down. I'm going to hold it sideways, and I'm going to show you how I do it while I'm working away at the bench. So I like to hold those 2 pieces together, and then I go in and out on one side and in and out on the other side. And I'm going to keep my little tail out and pull that in later. I hop back over to the other side. I go down through the same stitch that I've already used, back out through the other one above it, and then down through this one and up through that one. And maybe do a few sets before I pull it taut. Down through this one, up through that one, down through this one, and up through that one. And I work along sort of holding them sideways like this. I was showing you that way earlier just so you could sort of get the ladder effect. You see you've got that sort of back and forth rung thing. Hold it at the bottom and then pull taut, and that puts the seam together. And you're just going to work all the way across. When you get to a corner like this, where you've sort of got those little chains where you join them, I'll catch up with you there in a second, and I'll show you how to kind of get across that little seam. Once you get up to a seam, you want to make sure that you've got a nice solid sort of seam running across lengthwise and widthwise. You don't really want any spaces. Now there's no magical way to do this. You can just sort of keep working along. I find if it looks a little messy through here, or you're not quite sure where to put your needle next, find the most obvious set of stitches that you're going to use on the other side, and then work up to the stitches that are on the inside. So some of these might be the chain stitches from before, and some of them might be regular stitches. It doesn't really matter. What you just want to do is eyeball the 2 stitches that you know you're going to work next. Work across the seam as best you can. Pull it taut and make sure that your seams are right opposite each other. And I'm just gonna, I'll use that piece right there. I'm going to work, I'm trying to get my needle to come out the next stitch that I want to use on the other side of my seam. And I'm going to do the same thing over here. So that's the next one I want. Pull it tight, and then just double check that my seams still run into each other. There's no space there. It's neat and tidy. And now I can just continue with that ladder stitch, keeping all of my stitches together. So I'm looking for those sets of stitches, and it's helpful to just sort of do a few at a time. If you feel like one is getting a little bit wider than the other, just stop, count all the stitches up to the next corner on one side and then on the other, and you shouldn't be any more than 1 out, because you can always fudge it if you have to. So that's another nice thing I like about sewing together the seams on my blankets. It gives me an opportunity to kind of cheat if I have to. And then you just continue. That's it. They're all together, and now all that's left to do is add a border. And like we say every year, you can go ahead and add the border of your choice to this blanket if you're in a rush to get it done because you're giving it away as a gift, or you can stick around and wait for the border tutorial that will be coming hopefully very shortly here to the channel. We hope you enjoyed working on the stitching together part of this blanket project with us this week. We will see you soon here on the Jayda and Stitches show. Until then, stay safe, stay crafty, and have an awesome week. Bye guys!
Hi everybody, Mr. InStitches here. Thank you for watching today. Here are some of our other videos you might be interested in. Oh, and don't forget to subscribe.